Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to week number 3 of our course. Hope everyone's doing well tonight. First off, thank you for your responses in Canvas essay number 1. I've had a chance to go through and review all of those. Very happy with them. I think all the discussions were well done. They were proofread. I think that some of the themes that came out of discussion number 1, some organizations did not fare very well in the assessments. I know the TSA was one of the organizations I saw listed a lot as one of the less effective organizations. The VA, I also saw listed. I think a lot of the problems in the VA, especially in recent years, have really been linked to a lack of funding from Congress. But oftentimes we see a lot of those very negative stories in the media about the VA. And so the VA did not fare very well in the assessments. Some of the organizations that did fare well, NASA, and that tracks pretty well with the Federal Employee Engagement Survey that's done every year at the federal level, where NASA usually ranks, if not the very top, very close to the top in terms of employee satisfaction and employee perceptions of organizational effectiveness. And so NASA usually does score pretty well in that regard. So they did well. CDC, for the most part, got pretty positive reviews with their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a challenging time, obviously, for the organization, pretty much unprecedented for the organization. But a lot of people talked about the elements of effectiveness and how the CDC responded to that type of a pandemic. So it was interesting to see some of the similarities and even some of the differences in the posts. What I saw also that I was very happy to see is the recognition of effectiveness as something that is multidimensional and multifaceted. The recognition that there are multiple ways in which we can define effectiveness. And when we do define effectiveness, we also have to take into account the context of the situation that that organization is facing. Those ideas of the multifaceted nature of effectiveness as well as the contextual nature of measuring effectiveness are two themes that we're going to pick up on as we go through our material for this evening. So as you prepare then for Canvas essay number 2, which is coming due then, your first response, your initial response should be done by Saturday, and then your response to the classmates should be done by Monday. For that one, you are going to build off of some of the information from last week's class, looking at differences between public and private sector organizations with an eye on what those differences mean for effectiveness. So for Canvas essay number 2, you will be looking at a public organization or nonprofit organization, depending upon which sector you are in, and then comparing a public or nonprofit organization to a private organization. Two main differences that you see between a public and a private sector organization, with again an eye on what those two differences mean then for the measurement and achievement of effectiveness. So that's going to be your second discussion board, your Canvas essay posting then for next week. Then also on Monday, as you know, you also then have your background paper that is due. And that background paper we've talked about before. It's a very brief analysis. You know, the page range, I don't really grade based upon the length of an assignment, but I usually say in the past, they tend to be somewhere 3 to 5 pages. So a very brief assignment wherein you are identifying the issue or the problem that you plan on using throughout the duration of the course. In the first part of the paper, you will be telling me about the issue or the problem, what it is, how it affects effectiveness, who may be involved with that issue or that problem. Then the second part of the paper, you'll give me some background on that issue. Where did it come from? Is it a new issue? Has it been around for a while? If it's an issue that's been around for a while, is it an issue that has been addressed in the past? And then how effective have those attempts been to try and resolve that problem? So title page, then description of the issue, background of the issue, and then if you are using any references, a reference sheet. But again, for this paper, it really depends upon the problem that you are identifying, whether or not you need to use outside resources. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, just a clarifying question for discussion forum number 2. The prompt on your syllabus says consider your organization. Do you still want us to do that?
That's completely up to you. If you're comfortable talking about your organization, then by all means, talk about your organization, compare it to a private sector organization. If you're not comfortable talking about your organization, that's completely fine as well. You can just talk more globally about two differences between public and private sector organizations.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, absolutely. And I want you to be comfortable. I don't want you, if you feel a little reticent to share about your organization, I completely understand that. You can then speak more globally. Christian, go ahead.
I just had a question about the discussion post. Do you still want us to include references since it's more of a personal, we're
Yeah.
giving a personal perspective of our organization? I just want to make sure that I do it correct.
Yeah, that's a good question. You're not required to for this one because, again, if you're talking about your organization and two differences between your organization and a private sector organization, there probably aren't going to be a whole lot of academic references that are going to be helpful for you in responding to that prompt. So you certainly, if you don't have the need to use any references, you're not required to for Canvas essay number 2. Very good. Good questions. So those are the assignments that are coming up. Again, this background paper is a short assignment. I don't think it'll take you terribly long to do it, but it kind of then sets the stage, as you know, then for the next paper, which is the alternative solutions paper, where you will develop 3 solutions. And then that will then set the stage for your chosen solution paper, where you will choose a solution that you believe is most appropriate to address the problem that you've identified here in your background paper. So that's where we are, that's where we are going. And then last week, we had spent our time talking about the differences between public and private sector organizations, kind of building off of that Graham Allison article. And as we talked about last week, Graham Allison's article tells us that some of the generic management functions are similar between the sectors, things like planning and organizing and staffing and directing and coordinating and reporting and budgeting. Those are management functions that are done pretty much regardless of which sector you are in. However, according to Allison, the difference between sectors really lies in how those functions are being done, how we staff, how we organize, how we direct. That really is the difference between public and private sectors. This week, we are going to kind of drill down a little bit more into one of those differences that we talked about between sectors, which was difference in the environment. And we just kind of briefly mentioned last week about the political environment in which public organizations operate, as opposed to a much less political environment for private sector organizations. This week, we're really going to delve into this idea of these differences in environments between public and private sectors. And the way in which we're going to do it tonight is we're going to look at external environment and internal environment. So we'll start with a discussion of the external environment and how the external environment has an impact upon the effectiveness of public organizations. Then we'll very quickly switch into a discussion of the internal environment, looking at the environment within the organization and what 150 years of organization theory literature tells us about the influence of the internal environment on organizational effectiveness. Now, if you looked at the slide deck for tonight, it's a very lengthy slide deck, but don't be concerned about that. We're not going to go through every single slide in the slide deck because I do recognize you've already had a course in organization behavior. I know you've already had a course in organization leadership. I went back and looked at your past courses. So I know you've already had exposure to a discussion of organization theory and some of the ways in which organization theorists tend to promote the effectiveness of organizations. So I don't think it'll be necessary for us to go through all of the details in that regard, but I do think it's important for us to kind of look at how the public administration literature has developed over the past 150 years in terms of the way in which we can measure effectiveness based upon the internal structure and the internal processes in that internal environment of public organizations. So not going to hit every single slide, but I did want to provide a full slide deck there for you so that kind of be a refresher for some of the information, hopefully, that you got in some of those previous courses. But let's start with a discussion of the external environment and some of the characteristics of the external environment that can have import for the effectiveness of a public organization. So we know one of the primary characteristics of the environment that can have an impact upon an organizational effectiveness is this first characteristic of the environment's capacity, the capacity of the environment to support the organization, to contribute to the growth and the survival of that organization. So when we talk about environmental capacity, we're basically talking about, does the environment have the resources necessary to provide to the organization to help the organization survive? So this is kind of a nod to open systems theory and authors like Katz and Kahn, and this recognition of this symbiotic relationship between the organization and the resources in its external environment. So my question to you is, when we look at the capacity of an environment to support the organization, what types of characteristics does the environment need to have in order to support an organization? What enhances the capacity of the environment to support that public organization? So to put it another way, what can the organization get from the environment that will contribute to the organization's survival? Any ideas?
I guess. Oh, go ahead.
Funding.
I'm sorry, one more time.
I said funding.
Funding, absolutely. Yeah, we need, as Norton Long always tells us, money is the lifeblood of an organization. Organization does not have funding, the organization will go out of existence. One great example of money being the lifeblood of the organization is back in the mid-1990s when Congress took away the funding for this organization known as the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, otherwise known as the USACIR. The Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations had been around since the 1950s. And that was an organization that did a lot of really great studies and a lot of research into the relationship between national, state, and local governments. In 1995, that organization, that commission, did what they called a draft report. It was a draft report looking at some legislation that had been passed by Congress to make recommendations to Congress about which pieces of legislation should continue, which piece of legislation should be handed over to state and local governments. And it was this draft report that was put together by the commission. The commission never approved the report, but a copy of that draft report got leaked out to members of Congress. Obviously, members of Congress did not like what they read in that draft report. And so in the next fiscal year, in fiscal year 1996, Congress decided to zero out the USACIR. And when Congress zeroes out an agency, it essentially just takes its funding away. When ACIR lost its funding, it had to go out of business. Director of ACIR, John Kincaid, could no longer pay staff. He could no longer pay the contracts that he had with investigators across the country. He no longer could pay the lease in the office building that they were leasing space in. And so he essentially just shuttered doors and closed up shop and went off to a small university in Pennsylvania and finished out his career. So that's an example of how important funding is and how Congress can just completely eliminate funding from an organization. So obviously, funding, money, resources, important characteristics of the environment. What else? What are some other important characteristics? I think Christian.
Human. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in text, I see that Christian had mentioned demand for services is important. That's absolutely true. You need to have client customer demand. A great example is an organization that used to be called the Rural Electrification Agency, or the REA. The job of the REA was to provide electrical service in rural areas of the country because there was great demand for electrical service. Well, eventually the REA got to pretty much all rural areas in the country, and there was electrical service across the entire nation, even in these rural areas. There was no longer that demand from those rural areas for that electrical service, and so there wasn't that support for the maintenance of the REA. So that's another example. But I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say not only human capital, but also the relationships, right? The external relationships that are needed in order to provide those services and also enhance the continuing process improvement process of the organization, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you've got two very important points there. The first point's human capital. And the second point is the maintenance of these important relationships with other elements in that environment. Human capital is vital to organizations. If the environment is not capable of providing an adequate, well-trained, well-skilled labor pool to organizations, organizations aren't going to be able to do their basic function of staffing. It's just not going to be possible, at least in that area. And so, yes, the environment must need to be able to provide an adequate labor pool of skilled workers for organizations. The other point you make is another important one. That's what you said, relationships. Maintain these relationships with other elements of the environment. It's important that agencies maintain the support of constituent groups, of client groups, of elected officials, of other governments. Once they start losing that support, then it's going to be difficult for that agency to survive in the future. So you need to really maintain those relationships well in order to continue that support to allow you to continue as an organization. Let's see, Leslie says authority to implement, regulate, and enforce the program. We've talked last week, this is very important. We talked last week about public organizations and the idea of them being governmental in nature, and that a government essentially has coercive power. If you want to decide if something is a government, you're looking for two primary characteristics. Governments should all have control over their jurisdiction, and then governments also have coercive power over their citizens. And so they can coerce citizens to do something they otherwise would not do. That whole idea of power, influencing someone to do something they otherwise would not do. So you need to have that level of legal authority in order to truly be a governmental entity. And so you need to have that type of authority. Regulation of programs and policies that we are implementing as an organization. Again, there are going to be a lot of elements of our environment that will have impacts and will exert pressures upon how we are implementing and executing our programs and our policies. So I think those are all very important elements of the environment that really suggest some environments having the capacity to support an organization while some environments lack that capacity. And we'll talk a little bit later on again, we'll circle back to open systems theory. But if you remember open systems theory from some of your previous courses, you know that in open systems theory, organizations obtain resources from their environment, this process that the authors refer to as negative entropy. That instead of an organization just decaying, dissipating resources in the environment, and then eventually not being able to sustain itself, it can offset these lost resources by importing new resources and energies from its external environment. And so that ability to bring in these external resources can only occur if the environment has those resources, if the environment has that capacity to be able to support the organization. Homogeneity is another important factor in terms of the ability of the environment to support and have an influence upon the organization. And here with the term, use of the term homogeneity, we're really talking about homogeneity of demands. Earlier in text chat, there's I think Christian had mentioned, demand for services. Well, the demands that are placed upon an organization from elements in the environment, sometimes those demands can be very similar to each other. They're very homogeneous types of demands. The more homogeneous the demands from the environment, the easier it is to respond to those homogeneous demands. The more heterogeneous those demands are, the more difficult it becomes for the organization to respond to all these various types of demands. So the more homogeneous the demands, oftentimes the easier it is for that organization to identify and then measure and achieve what they would consider to be effectiveness. It's a much more direct and much more easy to measure type of process. The amount of stability of turbulence in the environment. How stable is the environment? How dynamic and how turbulent is that environment? Obviously, the more stable the environment is, the less adjustments and the less changes the organization is going to have to make on the fly. The more turbulent the environment, the more changes and the more quickly they're going to have to respond to those changes in their environment. So stability and turbulence can have an impact upon organizations. Concentration or dispersion of resources within the environment. How concentrated are resources? How dispersed are those resources? So think about it in terms of the source of revenue. So if we're a public organization and we are funded nearly exclusively through appropriations, those are concentrated resources. We know where to go to get those resources. We know that we go to the state legislature. We know we go to Congress, and through those appropriation bills or those budget bills, that's where we're going to get our resources. So the resources should be relatively concentrated. If you want to augment your resources, obviously you know who to go to. You're going to go to elected officials and committee chairs, and that's where you're going to get your additional resources. However, if you are not funded through appropriations and you're more of a nonprofit type of organization and you're funded by grants, then obviously your resources are going to be much more dispersed throughout the environment. And you're going to be writing different grant proposals to different organizations throughout your environment. So it becomes much muddier and much more difficult and also less stable in terms of finding those resources and acquiring those resources. The amount of consensus or dissensus within the environment also will have an impact upon an organization. How much agreement is there within the environment in terms of, yes, this is the way we should approach this problem? That's going to make it much easier for you to address that problem. If you have a lot of dissensus, you have a lot of disagreement, then obviously it's going to be more difficult for you to build that repository of support that will then help you come up with one way to address this problem or this issue. So again, not to belabor the point too much, but I think that we all know that the external environment certainly has a major impact upon programs and upon organizations and their ability to be effective. Just we don't oftentimes sit down and say, well, what aspects of the environment have those major impacts upon effectiveness? And I think it's capacity, homogeneity of demands, stability, concentration of resources, and consensus among actors within that external environment. We know in that external environment, the external environment is a very political environment. That's what differentiates what we do in the public sector to what gets done in the private sector. So we know under our many masters theory that we have a lot of different influences that are being placed upon us. And I agree with Karen, employee support is very helpful. And that employee support that you get from the internal aspects of your environment will then help complement the support you get from your external environment. So you have to focus on both the external as well as the internal. But in our external environment, we are serving these many masters. We know we serve the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So in terms of serving the legislature, how does the legislature affect organizations? Well, number one, we already mentioned, they affect organizations through the process of appropriations by giving resources to those organizations. Now, we have a propensity at the national level in recent years of not coming to budget agreements in time for the new fiscal year. And we oftentimes end up going into partial government shutdowns. We were on the very edge, the verge of a partial government shutdown this year. And when we have those partial government shutdowns, then for all those agencies at the federal level that have not had their appropriation bills passed and signed yet, those areas do not have spending authority once the new fiscal year begins. So if you don't have spending authority, you go into a partial government shutdown. Even if you get a continuing resolution to avoid that government shutdown, you're still only going to be funded at usually about 75 to 80% of the amount that you were funded last year. So the political wrangling over getting budgets done can certainly have a direct influence on the effectiveness of organizations. Also, not only do we not get budgets done on time, but if you go back to 1969, there have only been 2 years from 1969 until today where we have actually run a federal budget surplus. In every single year, with the exception of 2, we have had a budget deficit. There is obviously a lack of willpower among members of Congress as well as the president over the years to make the difficult spending cuts and combine those with difficult choices in terms of tax revenue enhancements in order to get us out of deficit spending. Deficit spending obviously can have a detrimental impact upon organizations because the more you are in deficit spending, the more pressure there is upon you to justify your budget requests, and there'll be more scrutiny on the budget requests that you are submitting every single year. Was also a question here in California not too long ago, back when Governor Schwarzenegger was governor, about if the California legislature does not get its budget done on time for the governor to sign that budget by the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st, can state organizations continue to operate without funding authority from the state legislature? And in the Schwarzenegger administration, we had a major problem getting a budget done on time. And there was a year where we did not get the budget done in time for the governor to sign it on July 1st. The governor said you can no longer operate state organizations because you do not have legal spending authority in order to be able to do that. And that claim then started working its way up through the state court system, made it all the way up to the steps of the California Supreme Court. And before the Supreme Court heard the case, California came to a budget agreement. So I'm sure it put enough pressure on budget makers in Sacramento to come to a budget agreement before the state Supreme Court actually chimed in on whether or not there's constitutional ability and authority for state organizations to operate in the absence of a state budget. But we got that close to answering that question here in California. Now, in recent years, that hasn't really been an issue. Because of changes of Proposition 13, you no longer need to have a 2/3 majority to pass a budget through the California state legislature. Now you only need a simple majority. You do still need 2/3 majority to raise taxes, but you only need a simple majority to pass the budget through the state legislature. That combined with the fact that the state assembly and the state senate are both heavily skewed toward the Democratic Party. 62 out of 80 seats in the assembly are democratically held. 32 out of 40 seats in the Senate are democratically held, and you have a Democratic governor. You have built-in Democratic supermajorities in the assembly and the Senate. So even though you only need a simple majority, if you needed a 2/3 majority, you're pretty close to having a 3/4 majority held by the Democratic Party. So it's become much easier for us to get that budget passed by June 15th and then signed by the governor by July 1st. Marie, I'm sorry, I've neglected looking text chat in the past couple of minutes, but a potential barrier in terms of whether a public organization have the support of Board of Supervisors. Absolutely, because the Board of Supervisors, that's one of the primary masters that you are going to be serving, especially if you're looking at the county level. And so, yes, you certainly have to have the support of the Board of Supervisors if you want to get those resources and to continue growing and surviving as an organization. So we have these legislative pressures that are being placed upon us. And a lot of those pressures come because of these political squabbles and these political disagreements that are going on. Now, obviously, those disagreements are much more profound at the federal level than they are here in the state of California. Whenever you have divided government like we have at the federal level, that's where you're going to see budgeting become very, very partisan in nature. And one of the reasons why it has become more partisan in nature, not to belabor this point too much, but one of the reasons why it's happened is because of partisan gerrymandering. And you're all very familiar, I'm sure, with redistricting and how redistricting works. Every 10 years, we have an enumeration conducted by the Census Bureau required by the US Constitution. We then use the results of that census, that enumeration of the population, to then redraw the district lines in the House of Representatives, as well as redrawing district lines in the state legislature. And we know what has happened is that parties in power have redistricted and they've redrawn these boundary lines to benefit their political parties. And so sometimes what they will do is if you have Democratic control, the Democratic Party will then gerrymander the districts to say, well, here is a large population of Republican voters in this area. So we can use either a cracking strategy where we will crack them up into different districts so that they are a minority in all these different districts, then helping us as the Democrats win those districts, or we can pack them together. We can say we're going to take all these Republican voters, we're going to put this area all in one district, kind of give up on that district, recognize that it's going to go to the Republican Party, but then all these other districts will then go Democratic, or vice versa. So it's not just the Democrats, the Republicans certainly do a lot of this partisan gerrymandering as well. It's kind of a pox on both houses. Well, so what? I love the question, so what? So we have these gerrymandered districts. Well, what does that mean? What that means is that we've created all these safe districts whereby they're safely Republican or they're safely Democratic. So the general elections no longer matter because this is such a highly Republican district that a Democrat is never going to win the general election. So all the focus then becomes on the primary election. And if you want to get reelected, which all office holders want to do, then you need to focus on winning your primary. Well, the voters who vote in primaries are different than the voters who vote in general elections. The ones who vote in primaries are much more ideologically extreme than the more mainstream voters you would get in a general election. So you have to then start to appeal to the ideological extreme of your political party. So we see the Republican Party shift to the right, and we see the Democratic Party shift to the left, and we have a hollowing out of the middle ground. The middle ground where we used to be able to get agreement and bipartisan budget bills. That is now so hollowed out that it becomes next to impossible for us to get the two parties to agree on appropriation bills by the beginning of the new fiscal year. That places a lot of pressure on our organizations in order to try and be effective because you don't know if you're going to have the funding once that new fiscal year begins. The executive branch. Obviously, we operate within the executive branch, and so we have a lot of influence placed upon us in terms of our attempts at being effective from the chief executive. There are some really good examples from both political parties in terms of how chief executives have tried to shape public organizations to fit their policy goals. You'll think about back in I think we had mentioned this maybe last week, back in the Reagan administration, when Reagan wanted to abolish the Department of Education. And so he appointed someone to be Secretary of Education who he thought would dismantle the Department of Education from inside. He wanted to shrink the budget of the Department of Education, to take a lot of the functions being done by the Department of Education and shift those down to state departments of education, to the point at which there would be no money left and nothing left for the federal Department of Education to do, and it would then end up getting zeroed out by Congress. That's an example of the executive actually trying to get rid of an organization like the Department of Education. Today, there's been a lot of coverage of President Biden and his student loan forgiveness programs. Well, a lot of those student loan forgiveness programs, they are kind of top line headlines, but the regulations that will govern the implementation of those programs, the writing of those regulations are then left to the Department of Education. The Department of Education, what it does obviously will be dictated by its charge to write these regulations. So the more forgiveness programs there are issued by the White House, the more regulations need to be written. And so there are less time and less resources for the Department of Education to devote to other types of expenditures. And instead, they need to really focus their energies on writing these rules and regulations to govern student loan forgiveness. So chief executives can have a major influence, obviously, on public organizations and their attempts to try and achieve effectiveness. Now, it may have seemed a little weird when you looked at this slide and you saw judiciary listed under political actors in the external environment. I think that it's becoming more and more true with each passing year that the judiciary does belong on this list of political actors. There are a lot of strategies that the judiciary can use in order to impact what organizations do and then have an impact upon how they achieve effectiveness. Things such as writs of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is an order telling an official, you must take this type of action under either civil or criminal penalty. What are called structural remedies, where if the courts have identified that this organization has violated someone's constitutional rights, then the court can issue structural remedies that will say, you must take these actions in order to try and remedy this violation of constitutional rights. Um, Things such as consent decrees, another example of the judiciary dictating actions that must be taken by public organizations. All these types of strategies are strategies that can be used by the judiciary that can have impacts upon the effectiveness and the operations of public organizations. I think I mentioned to you a couple of weeks ago when I was at the conference, and one of the things I talked about in my presentation was qualified immunity and the changing definition of qualified immunity by the courts. That can also have an impact upon public administrators. If we are narrowing qualified immunity and making public administrators more susceptible to civil and criminal prosecutions, that may end up making those public administrators much more cautious in the decisions that they make. And by making them more cautious, it may have an impact upon effectiveness. Other agencies, other public organizations. You know, we talked before about governing networks and how the trend in public administration is really toward these governing networks where agencies are working together to implement these policies and these programs, and how it's relatively unusual today to have one agency in charge of the implementation of a given program. Oftentimes we have multiple agencies responsible for different parts of those programs and those policies. So our agency can certainly be impacted by the decisions, the behaviors of other agencies within our governing network. Sometimes we have turf wars that emerge between agencies as well. And so those turf wars can have an impact upon the effectiveness of those organizations. Interest groups. We know that interest groups are not only involved and interested in, no pun intended, legislation, but they are also very interested in the administrative rulemaking process. And as public administrators in our public organizations, we are oftentimes engaged in that public rulemaking process. And so therefore, we get a lot of this pressure applied to us by interest groups as we are writing these rules and these regulations. And then obviously the media, I think it goes without saying, just the influence the media can have on the behaviors and actions of public organizations. We're in this fishbowl. We have media outlets doing series like the Fleecing of America and things such as that, pointing out the wasteful government spending, pointing out potential government corruption, which obviously is a good thing if there is wasteful spending for that to be pointed out, if there is corruption for that to be pointed out. But it also means that there is a lot of scrutiny that we get from the mass media. So we do operate in a very complex, very political environment with all of these different influences that are being placed upon us and our ability to be effective as organizations. So the external environment certainly does have an impact on effectiveness. But we know the internal environment within our organizations will also have a major impact upon effectiveness as well. As I said before, we are fortunate to have about 150 years of literature looking at the internal aspects of public organizations and what those internal aspects mean for achieving organizational effectiveness. And since you have had a course not only in organization behavior, you've also had a course in organization leadership, I'm assuming that you're kind of pretty well versed in a lot of that organization theory literature. So I don't think we need to go through all of it here tonight, but just kind of as a refresher, take a look at some of the schools of thought that have developed in public administration over the years and what those schools of thought say about how we can make our organizations effective by focusing on the internal aspects and the internal dimensions within the internal environment of our organizations. So I'm sure when you talked about organization theory, I'm sure that you've talked about the classical school of organization theory. And I'm sure you're familiar with the classical school, and you're familiar with people such as our good friend Max Weber. Tell me about Max Weber. How did Max Weber envision making an organization effective? Remember our good friend Max Weber, German sociologist writing in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. I'm often told that one of the nice things about this course is that it's kind of a refresher and kind of pulls a lot of the information that you learned in the program together and kind of focuses on a purpose, which is to try and make our organizations more effective. So what did Max Weber say about organizational effectiveness?
So he's really into like hierarchies and rigidness in the organizations. So a clear, separation of duties or assignments would presumably make an organization more effective in Weber's eyes.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I couldn't say it better myself. That Weber looked at the structure of the internal organization. He wanted to look at the structure of the organization and said, if we can come up with the ideal structure of an organization, that ideal structure can then make our organizations effective. And as you correctly said, that ideal structure is very hierarchical in nature. It's a very top-down, centralized type of structure predicated upon things like division of labor. We divide up the work among our employees. Once work is divided among our employees, those employees then specialize in those tasks on a daily basis. Once you are specializing in specific tasks and you're doing them day in and day out, you then become an expert at those tasks. So we then have these organizational structures that are populated by experts. These experts are bound by rules and regulations. Weber believed very strongly in written documentation. We write down the rules, we write down the regulations, and we then apply those to everyone we come into contact with so that we can be more efficient, more effective, and so we can also protect individual rights. So we are not dealing with people in an arbitrary, capricious, or prejudicial nature. So you've got these professional career administrators who are experts, who are specialized in specific tasks, and how they do those tasks and how they interface with the public will then be governed by these written rules and these written regulations. A very stringent, as you said, very rigid type of structure, what he referred to as his ideal bureaucracy. So very early on in the classical school, when we're looking at the internal environment for Weber, if we structure our organizations in this hierarchical, very formalized model, that type of hierarchical formalized model is what will make our organizations more effective. But his focus was very much on structure. It was very much focused on kind of this one size fits all approach. That if we can structure all of our organizations in this ideal structure, that's how we can make these organizations effective. He very much focused on control, that we needed this control, we needed this type of centralized, top down type of hierarchy in order to make our organizations effective. This top down hierarchical control would then control the processes that are going on inside our organization. We would have a lot of direct supervision, a lot of standardization of what we are doing as an organization. And we will then hold people accountable for adhering to these rules and these regulations. It's very much of a legal compliance type of punitive way in which we are holding people accountable for the actions they are taking within this very structured type of organization. So that's kind of the classical Max Weber definition of how we make our organizations effective. We do know that there are limitations that were associated with Weber's ideal bureaucracy. The number one limitation, it really didn't focus on individual employees, and it was kind of dehumanizing to the individuals who were working within these organizations. Frederick Taylor, another classical theorist. Tell me about Frederick Taylor. How did he say we can make our organizations efficient and effective?
Taylor's kind of associated with the like civil service movement of like finding the right candidates or qualified candidates and basing it a lot on skill.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It really is kind of the beginning, if you will, of this idea of our more modern system of civil service. You know, England had a civil service system back well into the early 1800s. And so we borrowed a lot of elements from England to create our American civil service system. But a lot of the elements of our current modern civil service system are certainly artifacts of Frederick Taylor in his approach of scientific management. And you would think about when Frederick Taylor was writing, he was writing at the time of a lot of unrest in a lot of our factory settings. You're familiar with Upton Sinclair and the jungle, and a lot of these recollections about how dehumanizing it was, how terrible these situations were in our factories. There was very little middle management in that you had upper level management and then you had workers, and you didn't have a whole lot in between. And so that's where he came up with this idea of his scientific management. And as Cynthia says, it's very much merit-based. We look at hiring people who are qualified to do the work. We look at people who have the requisite skills and abilities to do the job. And then what we will do is we will go and do this time series type of study. And this is what we call the time series analysis, where we would go and we would look at time motion study. I'm sorry, not time series. That's statistics, a time motion study, where we will look at every single motion, every single activity that an employee engaged in as they are doing their job. And we will then stand behind them literally with a stopwatch, and we will time every single motion that they take. And the idea is that we will eliminate all the motions that are not effective and not efficient, and we will combine all the effective and efficient motions together into what we refer to as the one best way to do the job. This was an attempt to try and eliminate this process at the time known as soldiering, where people would just do as little as possible just to get by. And the way in which you can eliminate that is by coming up with the one best way to do the job and then using that one best way to establish performance expectations for these employees. And you then reward them for doing the job in that one best way. So scientific management was really focused very much on a standardization of the processes of work internal to the organization. So one of the differences between Weber and Taylor is Weber said effectiveness can come from focusing on the structure and coming up with the one best way to structure the organization. Frederick Taylor said we can be effective and efficient as an organization by coming up with the one best way to do the job. And he focused more on the process of doing jobs through these time motion studies and this idea known as scientific management. And it's true that a lot of these elements from Taylor's work we see in our current system of civil service. Our position classification system is a direct artifact of a lot of this work done by Frederick Taylor. The idea of having job analysis. I'm sure you've done the HR course, so you know what job analysis is. Job evaluations, coming up with job descriptions, taking all this information and putting together a position classification system with pay bands and pay grades. That is all basically comes from this idea of Frederick Taylor and scientific management. So for Taylor, when he looks at the internal environment of the organization, his focus was on work processes and the standardization of work processes, coming up with the one best way to do the job. Obviously, the criticisms of Frederick Taylor were some of the same criticisms that we saw with Max Weber. It was very dehumanizing. Not to get too much into Frederick Taylor, but in a lot of his writings, he referred to people as being boorish beasts. He called them cogs in the machinery, that if a cog is broken in the machine, you take the cog out, you throw it away. you replace it with a new car. Well, same thing with an employee. You take the employee out, you throw them away, you replace them with a new employee. You incentivize people to do the job in the one best way by providing them with merit pay, by giving them bonus pay. So you give them that type of remuneration in order to get them to continue doing the job in the one best way. Again, for scientific manager and Frederick Taylor, he focused on the internal process. He focused on the goals of the organization being efficiency and effectiveness, and he controlled production through holding people compliant to the one best way to do the job and then rewarding them if they did that job in the one best way. But again, he is part of this classical school looking at how can we make our organizations effective by focusing on the internal processes that are going on within that internal environment. Henri Fayol is another that I put in the classical school. Fayol talked to us about the importance of understanding how we govern our organizations, and basically said that if we want to be effective as an organization, we had to focus not just on the management of the organization, but the overall governance of the organization. And he argued that management is only one aspect of this overall governance. And he would argue that governance of an organization includes not just management skills, but it also includes what he calls technical activities. How well we are managing and using the technology that is necessary for producing the goods and the services that we are producing as an organization. Another aspect of the governance of an organization, commercial activities. Commercial activities, how are we engaging in transactions with our environment to make sure that we are, if we're selling goods and services, how we are selling those goods and services in the most efficient and effective way to our consumers. Financial activities, how are we managing our budget? How are we spending our money? Security activities, how are we keeping not just our employees safe, but also keeping safe our intellectual property? So some of the specific ways in which we are creating the products we are creating. How do we provide for those to be secure, to make sure others aren't coming in and stealing those intellectual properties? Accounting activities, how do we account for the money that we are spending through audits? Those are all aspects of what Fayol argued is the overall governance of an organization. And we cannot have an effective organization unless we do an effective job at all of those elements: management, technical, commercial, financial, security, and accounting activities. So he boiled it down to there are 5 essential functions that public and private sector managers do. They engage in planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. These are very similar to those generic management functions that are talked about by our good friend Graham Allison in that classic article. From there, he then distilled those functions into discrete, what he called principles of management. And this is kind of the beginning of what's known as the principle school of management in the classical school. The idea that if we could adhere to these discrete principles, the adherence to these principles could then make our organizations effective. Some of them are very similar because they're a reflection of Max Weber, things like division of work, providing authority, delegating authority to employees, which will then make them more responsible for their actions, having a system of discipline within our organization, having this unity of command, like Max Weber tells us, this top-down type of hierarchical structure, subordinating private interests to general interests, meaning that we will subordinate our private interests to the interest of the public. A system of remuneration, compensation based upon how well someone is performing, centralized hierarchy, a chain of command, order, equity in how we are treating our employees, a stable personnel base. Again, these are career employees like under Max Weber's approach. Incentivizing initiative, allowing people to see that they can take initiative without worrying about getting in trouble in case those approaches do not work. And then instilling this esprit de corps, the spirit of togetherness, the spirit of teamwork throughout the organization. Vail argued if we could adhere to those principles of management, that's how we could be effective as an organization. Very similar to that, our good friend Luther Gulick, and you've probably read about Luther Gulick before, was another one of these principles types of theorists who also believed that if we could establish and then have our managers adhere to these principles, that is what will make us effective as an organization. These generic management principles, such as planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting, what, as you know, is going to be known as the POS Corp School. And these are essentially tools that we can provide to our managers in very much of a managerial toolkit, so that depending on the situation they're in, they can reach into their managerial toolkit, they can pull out their planning tool and plan the operations of their organization. They can reach in and pull out their budgeting tool when they need to construct and analyze and manage their budgets. That if we can train our managers in these principles, in these tools, that's what will then make our organizations effective. What really does tie a lot of these classical theories together, Weber, Taylor, Vail, Gulick, what ties them together is this focus on the internal in the organization, as well as this search for the one-size-fits-all approach. That if we can, according to Weber, structure our organization in this ideal way, if we can come up with the one best way to do the job, as Taylor tells us, if we can identify and teach these principles to our managers, as Vail and Gulick tell us, then those are the types of things that will lead to effectiveness in an organization. But it's very much this panacea, this cure-all, this one-size-fits-all approach that can be applied to all organizations to make all organizations effective. What was lacking in the classical school was, again, this focus on individual employees. And this lack of a focus on individual employees, as you know, then led to the rise of what's known as the human relations school. The human relations school tried to address that missing element in the classical school by looking more at individual employees and recognizing more the social components within an organization. The internal environment of an organization is by definition a social environment. People are human beings, they are social animals. They have certain needs for engaging and interacting with other human beings. We need to take that social aspect into account in order to make our organizations more effective. So the whole purpose of this human relations approach to organizational effectiveness was to try and address and mitigate some of those flaws in scientific management and the classical school. One of my favorite authors who kind of predated the human relations approach a little bit is Mary Parker Follett. And I really like Mary Parker Follett a lot because she was one of the only people in the 1920s who was willing to stand up and take issue with scientific management in the classical school. So as all these other organizations were adopting scientific management in not only the private, but also in the public sector, here was Mary Parker Follett kind of being that lone voice in the wilderness who was willing to stand up and say, there are some flaws associated with scientific management, and we need to try and address those flaws. One of the interesting aspects of Follett in her perspective on organizational effectiveness was this idea of running our organizations as democratic organizations. She thought the most effective organizations would be democratic organizations. Democratic organizations that were predicated upon participation, that allowed employees to participate in decision-making and participate in their own governance. Follett argues that even though the democratic organization is essentially the way to go with organizational effectiveness, she also understood that there are some fundamental flaws associated with a representative democracy. Those fundamental flaws are things such as particularized interest and passive citizens. And she said these are flaws that also will be flaws in a democratic organization as well. So is anyone familiar with Mary Parker Follett and what she means by particularized interest and passive citizens? I don't know if you covered Mary Parker Follett in previous courses before, but okay. Then what she means when she's talking about particularized interest and passive citizens is she's saying, whenever you have a democratic system of government, you have kind of this marketplace of ideas where people are able to express their opinions, and their opinions are probably going to come into conflict with other people's opinions. That people tend to have things that they're trying to accomplish by expressing their opinions. And so they have these vested interests. And it's kind of what James Madison back in the 1700s referred to as factions. And if you remember back to your American government course and you perhaps read the Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 10 is where Madison talks about the problem associated with factions. That in a democracy, we have all these different groups who all have different vested interests and different things that they're trying to achieve. That occurs in a democratic organization as well. So you're going to have these particularized types of interests. So you're going to necessarily have conflict within democratic organizations. It's not a matter of trying to avoid conflict to become effective as an organization, but rather it's a matter of how can we manage that conflict positively and productively. And she says, if you look at how people participate in a democracy provides you multiple avenues for participation, what a famous federalism scholar named Morton Grodson's referred to as multiple crack theory. In our system of democracy, with all of our different levels of government and our separation of powers, we have all these different avenues that we as citizens can take advantage of in advocating for ourselves and expressing our interests and our opinions. So we could write letters to our members of the state legislature or members of Congress or members of the city council. We could contribute to campaigns. We could work on campaigns. We could run for office ourselves. We could engage in political dialogue and discourse, and we can vote. Lots of different ways we can participate. Voting tends to be the least costly, the least time intensive and time consuming endeavor as compared to all those other avenues for participation. So people tend to choose voting over all those other possible avenues. And especially if you look at today in California, we have everyone gets a mail ballot automatically. And you can just vote from home. You can then drop it in a vote box. You can drop it in the mail. So it makes it very easy and very low cost option to vote today. That, she says, creates passivity on the part of our citizens. So what we need to do is we need to actively engage people in order to make them more active in their decision making, and then also come up with ways in which we can productively manage conflict, which is inevitable not just in a democracy, but also in a democratic organization. So how do we deal with conflict that is inevitable in a democratic organization? There are three ways you can deal with conflict. You can deal with conflict through domination, compromise, or integration. Follett argues that domination is the least successful way of dealing with conflict. Domination is one party wins, one party loses. It's kind of the zero-sum game theory. That's the worst way to deal with conflict because those who lose are obviously going to be disaffected. They're not going to want to buy in to the decision that's made by the organization. So she kind of dismisses that and says that's not a good way to deal with conflict. A better way, but not the best way, is compromise and negotiation. In compromise and negotiation, both parties give up something in order to come to an agreement. Well, at least you can get an agreement that way, and it's better than domination. But since both parties are giving up something, both parties are going to be somewhat disaffected and somewhat disgruntled by the result of dealing with that conflict. She says the most appropriate way, we're going to avoid saying best, but the most appropriate way to deal with conflict in an effective organization is through the integration and interpenetration of ideas. Essentially, this is this marketplace of ideas. By allowing people to participate, allowing people to share ideas amongst each other, you'll have this interpenetration of ideas where I may have never thought of the way in which you're approaching an issue, but now I am, because you've told me about it. It's kind of interpenetrated into my way of thinking. And so this can then lead to what she calls integration, whereby we can integrate all these ideas together and synthesize them into a new and different way of addressing the conflict or solving a problem. In this manner, everyone is involved. Everyone then has buy-in into how that conflict was resolved. So she really believes integration is certainly the most appropriate way in which we can deal with conflict. She also says we need to get people to participate in their own governance by helping our employees build their power base, build their skill base, build their resource base, build their ability to better be able to participate in the integration and interpenetration process. Leslie, go ahead.
Is there like an ideal size of government or organization that we're dealing with this idea? I mean, it sounds like integration and interpenetration of ideas is a very time and, labor intensive process that would take a long time, and depending on how many people were involved could be quite a complicated series of asks. So I'm wondering, like, is it only successful at a certain size of government or legislation or whatever we're talking about?
Right. And that's an outstanding point. And you're right. One of the criticisms of Mary Parker Fall is the actual how realistic it is. And I think you're right. When you're dealing with a large organization, especially a large organization that adheres to a very hierarchical type of structure, this is going to be relatively difficult to do. This certainly does work better in smaller organizations, but it also works better in flatter types of hierarchies. And so the solution to this, according to Follett and later on her students, is to kind of break up the organization into different parts. And so you kind of deconstruct the organization into different elements so that you have these smaller units, these smaller departments that are doing this type of integration, as opposed to trying to do it through the entire organization. Because you're right, this is not very practical if you have a very large, very institutionally rigid, very hierarchical type of organization. This is not going to be a very practical type of an approach. And so, yeah, it tends to work better in smaller, flatter types of hierarchies. But her principles of organization are we need to get people to participate in their own governance. We need to try and coordinate between our departments and individuals through this integration process. We need to do it very early on. We need to do it as soon as we can. As soon as people enter into the organization, they essentially are then exposed to this participatory type of culture. And we also have to recognize that when we do this coordination to enhance participation, that it's a very dynamic type of coordination, in that it's going to depend upon the people involved as well as the organization, the functions of the organization, the types of goods and services being provided by that organization. For the first time, really, Mary Parker Fall is really saying that we can't really rely upon the one-size-fits-all approach. It really depends upon the situation itself. And another aspect of Follett's work that's become very well known is her approach to situational leadership, that we lead according to the situation in which we find ourselves. There's no longer a panacea. There's no longer this type of a silver bullet. But again, like you said, the major criticism is it may not be as practical as it could be in a very large, very hierarchical type of organization. Or at least what she is doing now is she's kind of shifting us away from that one-size-fits-all approach and that very dehumanizing approach that the classical school took toward individual employees. But as I said, another limitation of Follett is when she was writing. She was a female who was writing in the 1920s. Obviously, a lot of her male counterparts didn't read her writing, they didn't take it seriously, but a lot of these theories that she was postulating in the 1920s were then theories that came about from human relations theorists 20, 30 years later in the 1940s and the 1950s. One very famous human relations theorist is Elton Mayo. I'm sure you've heard of Elton Mayo before. Elton Mayo kind of told us that we had a problem in our organizations. And the problem in our organizations is that our organizations are staffed by human beings. Those human beings can sometimes be irrational in the way in which they make their decisions. So if you're taking these sometimes irrational human beings and you are placing them into what was then a very regimented, hierarchical type of factory system, you're compounding the problem. You're not allowing them to have these social interactions with their fellow employees. And so he was very well known for his studies. The one that he's best known for is the Hawthorne experiments. So tell me about the Hawthorne experiments. What do you remember about the Hawthorne experiments?
I think it was when surveillance changes behavior. People are expecting to be watched, so they change their behavior because they're being watched.
Absolutely. Perfect. It's what's called the Hawthorne effect. And that is when people are being observed, they change their behavior. They act differently when they know they are being observed. I, many years ago, taught an undergraduate social science research course. And one of the assignments was to go and watch the webcam for Times Square and to watch it at different times of the week, at different times of the day, and look at human behavior and look at how human behavior different. And what the students always found is that people, when they were alone, acted a lot differently than when they were in a group of friends or a group of colleagues. That when people know they're being watched, they are going to act differently. And so he did this study at the Hawthorne electrical plant where he decided, let's take a look at if we change the physical stimulus, what impact will that have on performance and productivity? So the stimulus that he chose was changing the lighting level. So his hypothesis was if we turn the lighting level up, productivity levels will go up as well because people can see what they're doing better because there's more light in the factory. Turns the lighting level up, productivity levels went up. Said, well, if we turn the lighting level down, then productivity levels should go down as well. Turn the lighting level down and productivity levels continue to go up. It wasn't the lighting level, it wasn't that physical stimulus, but rather it was the social aspect that the people, the workers in the factory knew they were being watched. They knew that they had these researchers there who were talking to them, asking them about their experiences, asking them about where they want to go in life and what types of promotions they may want. They were actually being respected as human beings, and it really led Mayo and his co-authors to recognize that there's informality and a social aspect to our organizations. Our organizations will never be truly effective if we only focus on the formal aspects, such as the structure of the work or the structure of the organization. We also have to recognize that organizations are social systems as well. And until we recognize that social aspect, until we recognize the more informal aspects of our organizations, we will never be able to be truly effective as an organization. And that was Mayo's primary contribution, if you will, to this human relations theory. So the nice thing about human relations theory is it has pulled us farther away from the classical school and made us realize that we need to pay attention to the employees within our organization, as was mentioned in text chat earlier, have their support, have their buy-in in order to be effective as an organization. The criticism of the human relations school is that the ultimate goal of doing this, the ultimate goal of paying attention to our employees and including them in decision making, was not necessarily to benefit them as individuals, but to make the organization more effective. So the goal was still a macro level, organizational level goal. We were doing all this in order to extract productivity from our employees, and that productivity would then make us more effective as an organization. That criticism is then what led us to our more human resource management types of theorists. And some of these people I know that you have heard about before. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them, but Abraham Maslow brings a psychological perspective to the understanding of organizations, makes this argument that every employee has this hierarchy of needs. This hierarchy of needs made up of physiological safety, belonging, esteem, and self-actualization needs. The bottom four needs of physiological safety, belongingness, and esteem are what Maslow referred to as deficiency needs, in that deficiencies in these different needs will then motivate employees to be more productive and to contribute more to the effectiveness of the organization. The top at the apex there is self-actualization is a growth need. So this is an ongoing need. This is the need to try and be all that you can be. The need to try and accomplish your utmost potential. Be the best person, the best human being that you can be. That's self-actualization. We never actually achieve that. We are always motivated to try and grow in terms of our self-actualization. So the bottom four were motivated by deficiencies in those needs. Self-actualization, as people, we are being motivated by always trying to grow in a continual process of trying to self-actualize. That's the classic Maslow approach to this thing called the hierarchy of needs. You need to pay attention to the hierarchy of needs among your employees so that you can better help them meet these needs to motivate them to be more productive and to perform better. Douglas McGregor was a big believer in Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and he's known for developing theory X and theory Y. Tell me about theory X and theory Y. What's the difference between theory X and theory Y? Anybody remember that?
Was theory X the one where it's motivation through carrot versus and the stick, and the Y is people with self-motivation or like self-starters?
Right? Exactly. Yeah, theory X is people are not very motivated. People are lazy. They are not terribly creative. They're not terribly intelligent. They basically need to be told what to do and how to do it, or else they're not going to get the job done. A very negative view of human nature is theory X. Theory Y is just the opposite of that. As you said, they are motivated. They are willing to work. They're creative. They are intelligent. Two completely diametrically opposed ways of viewing human nature, theory X versus theory Y. The big so what here with Douglas McGregor is that the majority of our employees, he argues, are theory Y types of employees. They are motivated, they're intelligent, they are creative. The problem is that they are shoehorned into theory X organizations. They're in very Weberian structured types of organizations, and theory X organizations does not allow a theory Y person to be theory Y. So according to McGregor, what we need to do is we need to transition our organizations away from theory X and make our organizations more theory Y in nature. And that's what will then make our organizations more effective. So strategies such as things like job enrichment. This was something he was very fond of, job enrichment. So in job enrichment, we will allow our employees to participate in the redesign of their jobs. We will ask them, what do you want to do? Where do you see yourself in 5 years or 10 years? What types of skills do you want to develop while you're in the organization? And then design their jobs to kind of enrich those types of skills that they want to get, give them those opportunities, acquire those skills so that they will have the skills and abilities they need to then move up in the organization or even move to another organization if that's something they end up doing in the future. So not only are we paying attention to our individual employees, but now we are changing and transforming our organizations themselves to help meet those needs of our individual employees. Kind of like taking the old John F. Kennedy, ask not what your nation can do for you, ask what you can do for your nation. This is more like, ask not what you can do for the organization, ask what the organization now can also do for you. It now creates kind of this two-way street of obligation between the organization and employees. And a student of Douglas McGregor, who is also considered a human resource management theorist, a good friend, Chris Argyris, picked up on McGregor's theories and kind of built upon them with his personal growth theory. Argyris argues that as people mature, they go through this personal growth process. In that, as they mature, they become much more active. They become much more active in their organizations, much more active in their communities. As people mature, they become much more independent, have this ability to act in much more independent ways. As they mature, they have the ability to behave in a multitude of different ways as well. They develop deepening interests. They have a longer time perspective. So it's no longer about what is good for next year. It's now 5, 10, 15 years down the road. They're not necessarily satisfied to stay in their positions. They want to aspire to superordinate positions. They seek out those higher levels of accountability and responsibility as they go through this personal growth type of trajectory. They develop a much greater self-awareness. They're much more aware of themselves. They're much more comfortable with themselves. The problem, according to Argyris, is that classic organizations, Theory X organizations, inhibit this personal growth trajectory. And so much like Douglas McGregor, he argues for transforming these organizations into Theory Y organizations that will better help people in their personal growth journey. So again, it's not just what the individual can do for the organization, but now it's what can the organization do to help the individual employee develop as a human resource. So now to be effective as an organization, it's not just about the organization. Now it's about what the organization can do for individual employees. So it's a real fundamental shift from how we defined organizational effectiveness back in the world of the classical organization theorists. Systems theory adds in another layer to our understanding of organizational effectiveness. And in systems theory, we start viewing our organizations as part of a larger environment, that they're one part of a whole. And the organization is an instrument for achieving goals and objectives that will contribute to this overall environment, this overall system. There are two approaches to systems theory that are important for our discussion tonight: natural systems theory and open systems theory. And it's important to discuss them separately because natural systems theory defines effectiveness a little bit differently than open systems theory does. In a natural systems type of perspective, we liken organizations to living organisms. Living organisms have a primary motivation of survival. So they want to take actions and engage in behaviors that will help them to survive into the future. And not to depress you, I think I said this last week, I don't want to depress you too much, but as living organisms, from the moment that they are born, they begin to decay. And so they begin to dissipate energy into the environment. What your focus is here in natural systems theory is to try and find a balance between the organization and its external environment, so that the internal processes of the organization will help that organization survive, will contribute to agency survival. Open systems perspective defines effectiveness a little bit differently. Instead of looking at the internal processes within the organization, now we start to look at the relationship between the organization and its environment. And this is where you start to get into that, what we started off the class talking about tonight, environmental capacity, looking at obtaining those resources from the external environment to contribute to the success of the organization. In both the natural systems and open systems approaches, systems don't have concrete existence. That systems are very dynamic and they can certainly change. That has major implications for our attempts at being effective as an organization. the more dynamic our environment, the more we're going to have to be reactive to that environment, the quicker we're going to have to respond to some of those dynamic changes. So the purpose in both natural as well as open systems theory is that organization is effective whenever it achieves its equilibrium. There is a point of equilibrium known as homeostasis. That point of equilibrium is what all organizations strive for. So that's a measure of their effectiveness, is can they obtain this level of equilibrium, this balance. For natural systems theory, the balance is internal to the organization. So just like with a human being is in a point of homeostasis, a point of equilibrium when your pulse rate is normal, your blood pressure is normal, you are devoid of diseases, you are at that point of equilibrium, you're at that point of homeostasis. So that's the point of equilibrium, the point of homeostasis for natural systems theorists. For open systems theorists, it's much more of a focus on the external environment. Let's just go straight to that. It's the external environment. And so the balance, the point of equilibrium, the homeostasis point is when the organization is in balance and harmony with its external environment. So now natural systems theorists would argue that from the moment an organization comes into existence, that organization is giving off and dissipating energy into its environment. Once it gets to the point where it has dissipated too much energy into its environment, it no longer has the resources to support itself, and it will then go out of existence. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to try and find a way to hold on to those resources and find that balance point to exist. That's a process known as entropy, the dissipation of resources and energy out into the environment. That's known as entropy. Open systems theorists say that entropy is not always a one-way process. There's a term that they refer to as negative entropy, whereby you can offset that loss of resources into your environment by importing new resources from the environment into your organization. And the better an organization can engage in negative entropy and bring in a new labor pool, bring in new monetary financial resources, bring in more political support, the better that organization has the ability to survive into the future. There are multiple ways that organizations can find that equilibrium, can find that point of homeostasis. Because there's a number of paths to get to that point of homeostasis, it's what's referred to as your 25-cent word of the night, equifinality. Equifinality in open systems theory says there are multiple ways that organizations can find that perfect balance point between the organization and its environment. For some organizations, it's increasing their appropriations. For other organizations, it's partnering with other agencies within its environment to leverage the resources of those agencies and the expertise of those agencies. For other agencies, it's developing a repository of political support among budget makers and elected officials. So there are multiple ways in which you can go about this. But the ultimate goal of both natural as well as open systems theory is to find that equilibrium, that balance, that point of homeostasis. And at that point, the organization is then considered to be effective. There is a middle ground. Let me back up a couple of slides here. There is a middle ground between natural systems theory and open systems theory. And that's what's known as middle range theory from a man named Robert Merton. Merton, in his middle range theory, questioned a lot of the assumptions of natural systems theory. He questioned the whole analogy of a living organism, that an organization is like a living organism. And he says that maybe not truly like a living organism, because not everything that an organization does is important for survival. Not everything that an organization does is important for a goal. Not everything an organization does is indispensable for that organization. So what Merton does is he kind of shifts our focus away from organizational survival and focuses it more to consequences of what the organization is doing. So for Merton, effectiveness is not really will the organization survive? Effectiveness is more about the consequences for the beneficiaries of the policies and programs that are being implemented by this organization. He essentially says, if we want to be effective as an organization, effectiveness means we are serving the wants, needs, and desires of our citizens, of consumers of the goods and services that we are producing. The problem, according to Merton, is again, we tend to have very classical organizations that have a lot of rules and a lot of regulations. As organizations age, they tend to grow larger. As they grow larger, they tend to become more complex. As they become more complex, they assume they need more rules and regulations to govern their activities. So they develop all these additional rules and regulations. Sometimes that will lead these organizations, according to Merton, to what he refers to as goal displacement, a bureaucratic dysfunction known as goal displacement. In goal displacement, the organization's primary goal is adhering to rules and regulations, as opposed to having their primary goal serving their citizens. He says that's goal displacement, that's dysfunction. We need to focus on what our citizens need, provide the consequences, provide the services that will benefit our beneficiaries. That is much more important for an effective organization than just adhering to rules and regulations. For Weber, if you adhere to the rules and regulations, you adhere to his structure, his ideal bureaucratic structure, you are effective as an organization. Here for Merton, that's not good enough to be effective as an organization. Now for Merton to be effective as an organization, you needed to meet the wants, needs, and desires of your citizens. But the problem is that, again, as organizations age, as they get larger, they develop more rules and regulations, and they build walls between the organization and the citizens that they are trying to serve. And this leads to this institutional rigidity, and it does not allow these organizations to be truly effective. So the addition here from Merton is that Merton's telling us it's really the consequences of what we are doing, as opposed to how we structure ourselves or how we write our rules and regulations. It's really the consequences of what we do that makes us effective as an organization. And we're almost done with this tour de force run through 150 years of organization theory literature, talking again about our views on the internal workings of the organization and what those views mean then for effectiveness. We'd already talked about external environment. Now we're talking about some of these theories looking internally to the organization itself. But I do know that we are past 7:30 and we probably could all use a real quick break. So let's go ahead and take a break until we'll say 7:45. Come back at 7:45. We'll then finish up our discussion of these different organization theorists and what they mean for organizational effectiveness. At that point in time, we'll then kind of assess where we are time-wise, and then if we have time remaining, I do have a breakout group exercise for us to do, but we'll kind of play that by ear. So take a break, come back at 7:45, and we'll finish up our discussion of what organization theorists have to say about organizational effectiveness. Okay, it's 7:45, so we are back. So let's finish up this discussion about the internal environment and perspectives on the internal environment of organizations, what that then means for organizational effectiveness. Structural contingency model is another one that I think really contributes a lot to our discussion of the internal environment and its impact upon effectiveness, because it really does pull us very far away from the classical school and this whole idea that there is a one-size-fits-all approach. Structural contingency is very similar to my favorite answer. It depends, in that the way in which you structure an organization for effectiveness will depend upon the specific context of that organization. Things such as the uncertainty of the environment in which that organization operates, the technologies that are used in that organization. There are different technologies that organizations use, and it's important that we match the technology to the appropriate situation. I won't get too far into it, but there's a theorist by the name of Thompson who talks about 3 different types of technologies. The first type of technology he talks about is what's called a long-linked technology. I'll put that in text chat, but oops, I'm just moving stuff around on my screen. Put that in text chat, long-linked technology. And in a, it should be long-linked technology, long-linked. And a long-linked technology, what you have is it's very, very similar to a factory type of setting, in that the work of one person then will dictate the work of another person, who will dictate the work of another person. It's kind of like that assembly line type of an approach where everyone is very much connected together, and that the work you're doing depends upon the work that was done by the person before you. And it should be log-linked technology. A second type of technology is what's known as a mediating technology. In a mediating technology, you are developing resources and finding resources and then putting people in contact with those resources. So a mediating technology could be something like an employment bureau. So that employment bureau's job is to try and get people jobs, to try and get people employed. And so what that agency does is it finds these job listings and then provides those job listings then to job seekers. So that's very much of this mediating type of technology. What we do most commonly in public organizations is what's known as an intensive type of technology. In an intensive technology, how we do our jobs will depend upon the situation we find ourselves in, who we are dealing with, the wants, needs, and desires of that individual will then help dictate how we are doing our jobs. In an intensive technology, it's a very dynamic type of technology, very dynamic way of doing your job. And it's something that's much more emblematic of what goes on in the public sector, as opposed to a log link type of approach or a more mediating type of approach to technology. But the technology that we use will have an impact upon how we measure and how we achieve effectiveness. The size of the organization, this was a point that was made earlier when we were talking about Mary Parker Follett and her theory of integration. The size of the organization will have an impact upon the strategies you use for effectiveness as well. Mary Parker Follett might work well in a smaller, more homogeneous organization. A larger, more hierarchical organization probably not going to work quite as well in. The strategy of the organization will also have an impact. So what's the strategy of the organization? What are its long-term goals? What are its short-term goals? And next week, we'll get into a discussion of the impact of long and short-term goals on organizational effectiveness. Resource dependency, how dependent is the organization on the resources in its external environment? Is it very dependent upon appropriations, very dependent upon grant proceeds, or is an organization that's able to really generate a lot of its own operating revenue and is very independent in terms of the resources that it needs? Public accountability. How accountable is the organization to the public? How many transparency and what types of transparency requirements are there? What types of public records requirements are there, and FOIA requirements are there? How much accountability is involved with that organization? So essentially, this just means you have to look at the context of the situation, and what may be an effective strategy for one organization will not be an effective strategy for another organization. And then one of my favorite schools of thought, organization culture. Every organization has its own unique culture, and we need to understand the culture of the organization before we're able to determine what strategies will lead to organizational effectiveness. Sheen is one of the primary authors when it comes to organization culture. And Sheen argues to us that there are these 3 levels of organization culture. There are artifacts, there are espoused values, and there are assumptions. And essentially, with organization culture, if you want to say the culture of the organization, you can look at meeting minutes, you can look at agendas for meetings. Those are all tangible artifacts of the organization, very easy to see, very easy to study. At a more hidden level, but still tangible, is what are called espoused values. These are going to be things such as the strategic plan, the goals and the objectives in that strategic plan, the mission of the organization, the vision of the organization, all these types of things we're going to talk about next week. Those are all somewhat tangible articulation of the organization's culture, how the organization behaves, what the organization values. At the deepest, most hidden level are basic assumptions. These are assumptions that we all hold as individuals, but we don't talk a whole lot about. So treating everyone with in a collegial manner, in a professional, respectful manner. That's something that we assume that we're going to do and how we're going to interact with each other. Absent a written civility code, we're probably not going to talk a whole lot about it. These are basic assumptions that everyone shares within the organization that will dictate how we act and how we behave as organization members. Cultures can be embedded into the organization by leaders. There are primary and secondary embedding mechanisms. Some things simple as slogans. So you come up with a slogan for the organization that embeds culture. Something such as how we reward and how we penalize behaviors, that can really serve for role modeling for other employees. Employees will see, well, this person did this and they're rewarded for it. This person did this and they received a punitive penalty for it. That will help you see what the organization values, what the leader of that organization values. But the culture of the organization, the expectations, the norms of behavior, those are different depending upon which organization you are looking at. And so again, this is kind of the death of this one size fits all approach to trying to enhance organizational effectiveness. One organization will probably not work equally well for another organization. So what does all this mean for our understanding of organizations and organizational effectiveness? Tonight, we have looked at the external environment and the internal environment, but we also need to recognize that the literature over the past 150 years has really moved more toward a view of the external environment, looking at the place of the organization within its larger surrounding external environment. So that's kind of the movement from internal more toward external. Another thing that we have learned in 150 years of organizational effectiveness literature is that we recognize the contextual nature of organizational effectiveness, that it depends upon the organization's culture, depends upon the size of the organization, depends upon the technologies used by that organization, depends upon the organization's relationship with its external environment, depends upon how resource dependent or independent the organization is. There is a contingency-based contextual nature to understanding the effectiveness of organizations. And then, as many people talked about in their responses to Canvas essay number 1, a recognition of a multiplicity of determinants of effectiveness, that there are a lot of different things that will make an organization effective or will detract from effectiveness. It's difficult sometimes for us to say this organization's effective, this organization's ineffective. And one of the things that I was kind of hoping you would see as you were working on your Canvas essays, and this came through in a lot of the essays, was that there could be some elements of an organization that can be deemed effective, and there could be some other elements of the organization deemed ineffective. It's difficult for it to paint with one broad brushstroke, this organization is effective, this organization is ineffective. We really have to drill down to what's actually going on in those organizations and recognize that there's a multiplicity of determinants of effectiveness. It's not all just about, did we achieve this stated goal? It could be about, did we develop additional resources from our environment? It could be about how satisfied our constituents are with the services that they are receiving. And do these goods and services that we are producing, are these meeting the wants, needs, and desires of those citizens, of those consumers? Essentially, it's the end of the search for the one best way to achieve organizational effectiveness. There is no one best way. There's only what is most appropriate for this given organization at this given period of time. I think that's a much more accurate way of viewing organizational effectiveness The problem is it's also a much more complicated way of viewing organizational effectiveness. It was very nice and easy when we had a one-size-fits-all type of an approach, that silver bullet. We no longer have that today. And so now we have to use a much more nuanced approach and truly understand not just the internal environment of our organization, but the external environment in which that organization operates. So it's an understanding of both internal as well as external environments that will get us toward a better understanding of how we can measure and then how we can achieve effectiveness as public and nonprofit organizations. At this point, I do have a question that I would like to ask you, because I know I've taught in a variety of different cohorts here in the CSUN program, and I know that there are different approaches depending upon the different cohorts. But in terms of your length of course, class sessions in these Zoom sessions, typically, are you 2 hours? Are you 2.5 hours? Are you 3 hours? Because I have seen a variety of different approaches used. I kind of want to conform to whatever approach you are used to as a cohort. 2 hours? So I'm seeing 2 hours across the board. All right, usually 2 hours. Okay, thank you for that. That helps me out a lot, because that helps me determine that we won't do breakout groups right now, because we are hitting 8 o'clock. I know last week I took you to 8:30, but if you're used to doing 6 to 8 as your Zoom sessions, then we're going to conform to that, and we will do 6 to 8 beginning tonight and moving on through the remainder of our sessions. So this breakout group assignment we won't do tonight, but we'll hold off on that in abeyance until next week. And then we get together next week, we will start our class with this breakout group assignment. We'll be looking at the aspects of external and internal environments that have an impact upon the effectiveness of your organizations. We'll do that in breakout groups. Then once our breakout groups are done, then we will move into a discussion of missions and goals. We'll talk about the importance of developing clear mission statements, strategic planning processes, coming up with operative as well as official goals, and what those official and operative goals then mean for the effectiveness of the organization. So that's what we will then plan to do next week. Remember, Canvas essay number 2, you have due, as well as the background paper. I have communicated with several people in terms of your topic for your background paper. And so far, every recommendation that's been given to me, I've approved and said, yes, that will work. If you still have a question about whether or not the issue or problem would work for this background paper, feel free to send me an email, and I'm more than happy to provide you feedback on that. Otherwise, I'm going to work as hard as I can to get your background papers graded by Tuesday. Now, I know they're coming in by midnight on Monday. That's a real quick turnaround time, but they are short papers. I'm going to do my best to get as many of those graded before we meet as a class next Tuesday at 6 o'clock. I probably won't be able to get through all of them, but I'll get through as many as I possibly can. All righty. I know we're out of time because we're 2 hours, but any questions or clarifications on any of this information from tonight on the importance of external and internal environments for organizational effectiveness? All right, then we'll land the plane right now at 8 o'clock. And thank you very much. I appreciate you being here tonight. I'll have the recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning. And again, reach out to me if you have any questions about the background paper, and I'm more than happy to help. So take care. Have a great night. Have a great week. Talk to you next Tuesday.
Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Take care.
everyone. Good night, Professor. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Bye.